they seriously left me behind. Moman the Black was supposed to fade from prominence, but Pandora's actor wasn't sure how he felt about vanishing into the obscurity of a dark forest. Granted, he had gotten curious about some of the ruins he had walked by and then spent the next few hours exploring the forest as Tigris Euphrates, but he never expected to return to an empty expedition camp. Baroness Saradnik probably brought them back to Warden's Vale to discuss Viscount Brennenthal's commission. The Baroness' approach to social functions was every bit as practical as everything else that she did. Even celebrations served one purpose or the other, if not several at once. As it would probably be awkward if he suddenly showed up mid-dinner, Pandora's actor took his time making his way back to Warden's Vale. Along the way, he came across an elder lich observing two warring highland tribes from a rocky outcropping. "What's going on here?" Pandora's actor asked. "This one is recording the interactions of the two groups of agents below," the undead mage replied. "Agents, agent-based modeling, huh?" It was a bit of wisdom left behind by the supreme beings in the great library of Ashurbanipal. One could supposedly simulate complex systems and glean data from the individuals acting within them. To their great shame, the three great minds of Nazarick could never seem to get it right even with the vast mental faculties they had been created with. For some reason, the natives never immediately recognized the supremeness of the Supreme One and didn't fling themselves on the ground in abject humility for being allowed to exist in the same world as he. There was clearly something wrong with their heads. The technique, it seemed, wasn't foreign to the locals, either. They didn't simulate things, but rather let them happen in reality, and Baroness Saradnik was the most extreme about it. The upper reaches had been transformed into a gigantic economic and social experiment, though its denizens had no clue about it. "Have there been any interesting developments?" Pandora's actor asked. "No." Pandora's actor waited for the elder lich to elaborate, but it seemed content with its answer. So much for seeing what's behind the reports. By and large, the administration's data was delivered in the sterile, no-nonsense style expected of the elder liches, but he had still hoped for something meatier on sight. All he could really say from what he had seen so far was that things were progressing. What they were progressing towards was another question. "How has the local economy been developing?" "Slowly," the elder lich said. "Transfers of goods between tribal populations more often occur as the result of conflict rather than trade. Has the royal court devised a method of taxing such transactions?" No. I believe the idea is to have the tribes gradually develop their own versions of more advanced economies. Exacting a portion of plunder as tribute would slow that process, and it wouldn't cast the Sorceress Kingdom in a very good light. We're supposed to be an upstanding, civilized nation, not some sort of organized criminal enterprise. In that case, this one estimates that revenues from this territory will not match those of a developed barony in the heartlands for half a millennium, if ever. Preservation of wealth and productive assets is a foreign concept to the local tribes. Well, that's why they've remained as wilderness tribes this entire time, no? The land is their productive asset, which currently cannot be taxed under the laws implemented in this special administrative region. I believe your colleagues collecting data along the river would say otherwise. Rudimentary concepts of regular trade have already taken root there. With trade comes ideas, so I don't share the same dismal projections. The nascent river trade was already giving many tribes a clear advantage over their landlocked rivals. As one might suspect, they used those advantages to more effectively pursue their traditional ways, expanding their territories and absorbing smaller tribes. How each tribe and race organized themselves was now only of interest to Baroness Saradnik, but also to the central administration, as their current laws had many holes and shortfalls when it came to non-human behaviors. For the time being, they were relying on the threat of force to uphold those laws, but continuing as they were would undoubtedly become burdensome with the Sorceress Kingdom expanding its borders and influence. They needed systems that would work for a multiracial population. The efforts of nobles like Baroness Saradnik and Baroness Gonye were currently their greatest leads to realizing those systems. There's Countess Wagner's planned trade delegation to the City-State Alliance in the spring, as well. We should have plenty of data to make comparisons by then. He left the elder lich to his observations, following the mountain slopes northeast toward Warden's Vale. Indeed, things in the Sorceress Kingdom seemed to be progressing steadily. Combined with Demiurge's work abroad, they were well on their way to appearing as an island of peace and prosperity in an increasingly troubled world. Twilight had long passed by the time he finally arrived in Warden's Vale. To his surprise, he found Baroness Zaradnik and her ladies maid outside the foundry on the southern end of the future city. The noblewoman inclined her head in greeting. "You survived," she said. "Of course," he chuckled. "I expected you to be entertaining your guests." The Baroness gestured toward a carriage parked nearby. "It's solely to carted them off at a decent clip once they seated themselves within. They're still enjoying themselves with the adventurers at the restaurant. I excused myself to see to some tasks. Speaking of which, how is Miss Faber coming along?" She was quite excited about her new work order. "I believe she's progressing splendidly," he replied. "I'm having her work with some Mithril law now." "I cannot begin to express how thankful I am for your help," Lady Zaradnik said. "There isn't much demand for the caliber of work that she's capable of here yet." "Is that so? What about tools necessary for the work of other artisans?" "Unless it's a blade of some kind, she won't be producing those sorts of goods. The work will go to its respective artisan." "Strict as ever, I see. Not that it was a bad thing. In fact, it was just the opposite. The experiment related to the girl, which also involved 24 subjects based in various locations around the Sorceress Kingdom, sought to determine how readily the natives picked up specialized job classes. They received basic training as blacksmiths before being tasked to exclusively forge specific categories of goods. In theory, this meant that they would begin with the blacksmith job class, then advance to become the specialists that their tasks guided them toward. Miss Faber was meant to advance from blacksmith to weaponsmith, and then to bladesmith. Pandora's actor sought to answer several other questions involving job class progression through the experiment and many others like it. The existence of certain individuals gaining certain prestige classes long before they should have been able to suggested that job class prerequisites did not exist or at the least weren't as stringent as they were in Yggdrasil. This was both intriguing and concerning at the same time. According to their master, the number of capstone prestige classes, the powerful, top-tier job classes that lay at the top of a mountain of prerequisites, like Eclipse and Valkyrie, that a build could obtain was limited by the levels that their prerequisites took up. Heteromorphs often had a good chunk of their level 100 cap taken up by racial class levels, so they ended up being pigeonholed into very specific builds with only 1 or 2 capstone classes. Humanoids, on the other hand, could have 2 or even 3 times the number of capstone classes as their heteromorphic counterparts depending on the synergy of their job class builds. When one considered how the natives of the world could seemingly skip prerequisites and manifest previously unknown job classes that had little to no respect for Yggdrasil's balance, it presented a disturbing possibility. Impossibly powerful individuals could exist in the world, ones with builds that minimized prerequisites and ended up with dozens of capstone classes. Such an individual could supersede the strength of even the 8th floor's defenders and bring ruin to Nazarick. Fortunately, a seemingly insurmountable wall lay between any native with that potential and the dreaded outcome. The first was that the natives they had encountered thus far appeared to be unaware that the job class system existed at all. Someone, somewhere had to have figured it out, however. Job classes left very clear and replicable indications of the system's existence, and the earliest evidence of potential players in the region dated from over half a millennium previous. People had centuries of accrued data to draw conclusions from, so Pandora's actor could only assume that there were entire civilizations taking advantage of that knowledge. The beastmen encountered in the Draconic Kingdom that effortlessly dispatched Baroness Zaradnik were potential examples of this, and thus utmost caution was demanded in their investigation. Economic restrictions presented the second major barrier. Using blacksmiths as an example, trying to do what they were doing in Miss Faber's bladesmith experiment was practically impossible for most individuals. A novice blacksmith could not simply sit around and wait for specific types of work, as they would starve in the process. Leveling also was a pain since experience seemed dependent on challenge relative to skill and class aptitudes. Something else that didn't exist in Yggdrasil seemed to vary by individual. As Baroness Zaradnik had mentioned, demand for what the natives considered extraordinary work was negligible and additionally limited by the scarcity of materials. A blacksmith wouldn't get far by making iron nails and simple tools for their entire career. Farmers could only level so much by growing mundane grains. Combatants faced fewer and fewer worthy opponents the stronger they became, and every worthy opponent was potentially one that ended their lives. These challenges were easily overcome, However, all the natives had to do was the same thing that Nazarek did. Investment in institutions allowed for the cultivation of specialists, and even insignificant tribes already did this to a small degree. Perhaps ironically, the more individualistic a society was, the less of a chance it had to produce individuals who stood above the rest. Maybe Nabril was on the right track all along with her constant referral to the natives as one bug or another. Specialization is the key to their success, after all. Despite the certainty that at least a few civilizations in their new world had grasped the job class system in some form and put it to work for them, the last few obstacles to producing threats to Nazarek suggested that such threats were next to non-existent. The first of those was the low-level state of the world. So far, nearly everything was laughably weak, and the remainder was still no true threat to Nazarek in its entirety. By the same token, materials that were middling by Yggdrasil standards were non-existent in their new world. Even if one surpassed the low-level barrier, the sheer lack of information that the natives had access to was crippling. Individuals who advanced beyond level 20 were essentially pioneers facing the unknown. All things considered, the great minds of Nazarek agreed that the odds of an existential threat to Nazarek were astronomically small. At best, some high-level natives benefited from institutional investment with access to equipment from past players. Their job class builds would be an absolute mess because reliable knowledge of high-level job classes, skills, spells, and abilities were legends of dubious veracity at best. Without foreknowledge, there was a near-infinite number of ways to slip up while scaling the pinnacles of power. This only applied to purely native civilizations, of course. Civilizations led by players, on the other hand. It would be foolish to assume that a country like the Sorceress Kingdom hadn't been founded in the past or wouldn't appear in the future. The slain theocracy, which was by all appearances an incomplete attempt at just that, existed, after all. And, so, the experiments commenced. To become the true masters of their new world, knowledge was required. To prove the supremacy of Nazarek, all challenges had to be overcome. If he said so himself, he was most suited to the task. He would scour the world and discover all of its secrets. He would collect the relics of Yggdrasil scattered far and wide. A true adventure lay before him, perhaps similar to the ones that the Supreme Beings embarked on in the past. One could say that I am learning how to fashion a new generation of NPCs, as well. His gaze went to Baroness Saradnik, who continued to ride silently alongside him while he was absorbed in his thoughts. From a certain perspective, she was the first of those NPCs and also served as a perfect prototype. She probably wouldn't even mind if he rebuilt her from scratch if it meant she would be even better than before. The resurrections were free, too. What are you adding to the point catalog? Miss Lenez mentioned that you ordered a new batch of weapon enchantments. Eh? How did she know I was done monologuing? I guess her powers of observation are getting up there. His moment form was that of a warrior, which meant he had little in the way of raw concealment. By assuming the forms of a few of the Supreme Beings, he found that the keen senses of rangers and rogues enabled them to read even the most insignificant amounts of body language, sound, and scent. This application of sensory abilities didn't exist in Yggdrasil, but, even so, their master in his infinite wisdom knew how to exploit it. Some of the rookies finally broke and bought weapons with basic enchantments, he said, so I ordered replacements. Not that I don't understand the sentiment, but it never ceases to amaze me how consistent that behavior is. Even after we made it clear that they could sell the equipment back to the point shop after they were done with it, they still tried to save up for choice items while taking all sorts of unnecessary punishment. Humans have a way of registering hardships as proof that their ventures are worthy of the effort, the Baroness said. This undesirable behavior won't end unless it's clear that what they're trying to do is impossible. Adding opponents that require magical weaponry to properly harm should help. There are too many demerits to that suggestion, Pandora's actor replied. Relying solely on specific opponents will drastically narrow down our encounter variety, thus simplifying training in a different way. If we merely sprinkle them in, the teams just resort to using magic to blast their way through. Ultimately, it will only have them upgrade their weapons and nothing else. Lord Mayor intends to raise the overall difficulty to resolve the problem. Again? The Baroness raised an eyebrow. Suffering builds character, or so they say. I'm hard-pressed to disagree given the results. How about you? Do you plan on using similar methods to train your recruits? I'm afraid you'll have to go through the proper channels for that answer. Strict indeed. It didn't matter if he was a member of the royal court, she wouldn't share any information that Moman didn't officially have access to despite their long-standing relationship. When he had first visited the military base in Warden's Vale, the undead were thoroughly confused when she chased the unauthorized entity out. "Are you acquainted with the Sorceress Kingdom's head of magic item development, by the way?" "I've met him before," Pandora's actor replied. "Why do you ask?" "He keeps sending us the strangest letters," Lady Zaradnik said. "I get the strong feeling that he has the same problem as our novice adventurers. He doesn't like anything that we're producing and exhorts us to delve into the abyss of magic. How should I say it? He's an ambitious fellow. Don't you aspire to have your companies create superior items? They are constantly improving, but I'm certain that the common folk have no interest in having their lighting plunging them into the abyss of magic." Pandora's actor chuckled at her reply. Despite seeing all sorts of unbelievably fantastical things by native standards, she ever remained grounded in her approach to governance and life in general. "Perhaps your comparison isn't too far off," he said, "but don't your magic casters carry the same enthusiasm?" "It's nowhere near as ambiguous," Lady Zaradnik replied. "Everyone has clear, achievable goals. Well, the necromancers are still making a collective, long-term study on how to turn themselves into elder liches. Is that possible?" "According to them, it is. It's rumored that several formerly living beings elsewhere in the world have already achieved lichdom." Yet another mystery. In Yggdrasil, a skeleton mage evolved into an elder lich using a specific item called the Book of the Dead. Skeleton mages in their current world, however, were mindless and didn't grow at all. Elder liches naturally manifested as elder liches. A human, or any other race, for that matter, should have required a world-class item to be able to change races in the way that the rumors claimed. The idea that world-class effects might be achievable by the natives without having access to world-class items was a matter of grave concern. At the same time, the locals only seemed to consider it a legendary feat. The local government certainly didn't invest any resources into obtaining the same power. It was a strange and irrational response to such information as far as he was concerned. "Do these rumors have anything to do with the Elder Lich who rules over a city far to the southeast?" "I have no idea," Baroness Zaradnik replied. "It may be worth investigating in the future, but it will take a while for the Sorceress Kingdom to grow its influence beyond the immediate region." Was the royal court considering reaching out to other undead powers after its success in the Katza Plains? "We would if we actually knew where they were," Pandora's actor replied. "Don't you think it's strange that the information that we have about the world beyond the immediate region is merely a collection of rumors and legends? That's simply a consequence of who delivers information, isn't it?" The Baroness said. "Merchant networks will share reliable information about trade and events internally. Everyone else relies on bards and other travelers, who only share what they consider interesting or entertaining. We won't ever get the sorts of information about far-off lands that we're looking for without going there ourselves." Then how would an event like the Battle of Katza Plains, the submission of the Empire, or the invasions of the Draconic Kingdom or the Holy Kingdom be perceived? That's a question better answered by Countess Wagner, but, as I understand things, we exist in a corner of the world that's about as far from anything important as possible. Furthermore, we're viewed as little more than savage primitives. Stories of distant countries being invaded or subjugated in such a place aren't noteworthy events. The Battle of Katza Plains stands out from the others due to the fact that it was prosecuted in such a novel way. Pandora's actor cursed internally. He had been afraid of that. In other words, news of the Sorceress Kingdom's helpful interventions and benevolent rule wouldn't make it far while something that raised its infamy likely had. The worst part about it was that they had no idea who was now aware of their existence and making preparations for whatever future they foresaw. Knowing the prevalent attitudes of the natives toward the undead, they might very well be facing walls of superstition and fear wherever they went. Their carriage dropped them off at the corner of the village square and Pandora's actor accompanied the Baroness back to her manor. He eyed the unassuming patches of dirt scattered outside the building. "It seems like Glaser's little projects are starting to bear fruit," he said. "Or maybe sprouts is a better way to describe it. The real test is whether they'll last," the Baroness said. "This soil is made up entirely of broken-down city refuse and dead slimes." He stopped to examine a patch of dirt near the road. It looked like any other sort of dirt to him. Hundreds of little sprouts carpeted the square-meter plot in stark contrast to the dark grey granite surrounding it. "Would you like to join me inside?" Lady Zaradnik gestured at the door to her manor. "It looks like you have something to discuss." The two Death Knights at the entrance offered sharp salutes as he passed between them. Lady Zaradnik's maids went about their preparations to entertain their guest after he was seated at the table in the former war room on the second floor. The Baroness descended from her bedroom to join him shortly after, though the only thing that seemed to have changed about her was that she had let her hair down. Her long waves of chestnut hair gave off a silky sheen in the magical lighting as she seated herself across from him. "The royal court reviewed the recently submitted development plans for the city here," he said. "I must say that it's an intriguing prospect, and ambitious. It will certainly be quite the sight to witness. Do you have any questions about the proposal?" "My questions are merely out of curiosity," Pandora's actor replied, "but the royal treasurer posed a few that must be answered. As you are a ranger, you must know that the plants that Lord Mayor brought for Glaza to raise are not mundane in any way." The Baroness nodded. "Yes, I realize that. Lord Mayor went so far as to explain what they were when I noted that. He wouldn't say where they were from, but he assured me that they wouldn't become invasive. It's the former that the royal treasurer is concerned about. Your development plans state that the public spaces of the city will be treated as common land. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but doesn't that mean that goods harvested from the public spaces of the city will belong to the first citizen who puts in the effort?" "That's a rather odd interpretation." Lady Zaradnik tilted her head curiously. "May I ask how in the world you managed to come up with such a thing? That should be the rational conclusion, should it not? Have you not heard of the tragedy of the commons?" A maid appeared and poured out 2 cups of tea. She laid out a platter of biscuits before lowering her head and taking her leave. "I can't say that I have," Baroness Zaradnik said. "Simply put, those who act out of rational self-interest will exploit common resources to the detriment of all others. A man may graze his cows on common land for more than they need to so that they may produce more milk and thus provide an opportunity for personal profit. Others, seeing this, will do the same. As a result, the common land becomes ruined from overgrazing." "I can't recall anything so silly ever happening before," Lady Zaradnik said. "Is this idea by any chance related to the Land Reorganization Act?" "As a matter of fact, yes. The House of Lords keeps unanimously voting down the act due to the clause that mandates the enclosure of common land for private redistribution." "Yes, I voted it down for the same reason. At the same time, the nobility is already applying the portions of the act that they see as beneficial according to the realities of the Sorcerer's Kingdom." Which was an extraordinarily annoying tactic to Albedo. With every passing day, her Land Reorganization Act lost more and more momentum because most of what it proposed to remedy was slowly, but surely, no longer becoming a problem. The more she tried to get the piece of legislation through, the more it seemed that she was wasting everyone's time. Of course, no one ever suggested that to her face. For the life of him, Pandora's actor also couldn't see what was wrong with the bill. It was a piece of economic wisdom left behind by the supreme beings, after all. Lady Zaradnik quietly sipped her tea, watching him with her dark brown eyes. "Then perhaps you can explain to me why it is that they keep rejecting it," he said. "I'm sure any of the other nobles could explain it to you better," the Baroness replied, "but, as a whole, the reason is that it undermines the aristocratic establishment and weakens our societal fabric. The royal court is proposing the seizure of communal land that has been managed by the people for generations in the interests of economic efficiency. The bill fails to propose how it will adequately compensate for the damage that this would cause, though, based on this tragedy of the commons that you proposed, perhaps the royal court thinks that it is saving us from some injustice?" "I can't speak for the others," Pandora's actor said, "but I never imagined that the bill would be seen as harmful. That's because whatever image this tragedy invoked couldn't be further from the truth. Common land isn't some pot that people can access for soup as much as they wish. Common land usage rights are what is deemed fair allocation by community consensus. The local magistrate is responsible for keeping people accountable according to that agreement, and the local lord enters the picture should forceful measures become necessary. This tragedy of the commons does not exist in the rural territories of Evrantal, only the triumph of community management. The very idea assumes that people are nothing more than unthinking animals. It's almost like an excuse to treat everyone as livestock." This motion to enclose common land alienates people from one another for no good reason. Not only does it distance the people from each other, it distances them from their lords and their sovereign. It has the effect of weakening the people's identity as villagers, denizens of a fief, and subjects of His Majesty the Sorcerer King. The nobles of the Sorceress Kingdom are rejecting the bill because it weakens the Sorceress Kingdom on multiple levels in favor of a short-sighted desire for industrial efficiency. Pandora's actor stared down at his steaming cup of tea. In truth, he had gone around asking the nobles of the duchy the very day that the House of Lords rejected Albedo's bill. Not only did he know that she would be infuriated by the rejection and would demand an explanation, but it was also an ideal opportunity to reinforce the notion that Momen the Black stood for the people of Irantal. By and large, Lady Zaradnik gave a simplified version of their rationale. In that case, he said, could you be so kind as to explain how this system of common land will work in practice here? It isn't complicated, Lady Zaradnik replied. Lord Mayor mentioned that the plants Glaza is tending to are supposed to grow around her tree and that the materials they produce are valuable to the Sorceress Kingdom. The city's custodians will be tending to the city's public spaces and the local culture discourages people from doing what they aren't supposed to be doing. I think I've lost sight of the part where this is supposedly common land, Pandora's actor said. Think of it as the evolution of common land. Lady Zaradnik's lips turned up slightly. A city is a population of specialists. It would hardly do to have them grow food and tend to herds on the side. The custodians of the city will be specialists themselves, druids, rangers, and their apprentices. Perhaps even farmers. The proceeds garnered by their efforts will fund the operations and maintenance of the city as a whole. This, of course, includes programs that promote the physical and social well-being of its citizens. Why didn't Mayor mention any of this? I should ask Cora next time. When he had asked about how things would work out in Warden's Vale, the Floor Guardian's answer was it should be fine, probably. The plants that Mayor had left with Glaza weren't too valuable by Yggdrasil standards, but they still produced materials that weren't obtainable anywhere else. Thus, Mayor's ambiguous answer drove Pandora's actor to figure out how the resulting resources would be handled. In the end, it appeared that everything would be fine, probably. I'll relay your words to the royal treasurer. Pandora's actor rose from his seat. Hopefully, they will be enough to answer his concerns. Baroness Zaradnik rose from her seat and lowered her head. It is always a pleasure to serve, she said. Hopefully, the next time that His Excellency the Royal Treasurer has questions for me, he will be kind enough to bring them up with me personally. What's going on here, exactly? Following the adventurer demonstration, they reconvened after a one-day break, mostly for the sake of Lady Waldenstein. When their tour resumed, Rangobot once again found himself at the army base in Warden's Vale. This time, they didn't come to register as guests, but to inspect the grounds and visit with its first class of recruits. Much like the various types of apprentices they had seen around Lady Zaradnik's territory, the recruits' time was split into vocational training in the morning, academic training in the afternoon, and personal time after dinner. As they were presumably rangers, combat was also involved, except what Rangobot was currently witnessing looked more like an impending slaughter. In the barren stone field before them, a girl faced off against a death knight that looked like it wanted nothing more than to turn her into a stain on its flamboyage. Hey, Timuia said in a low voice, is she going to be all right? How could that possibly be? Lady Waldenstein replied. Maybe she's stronger than she looks, Rangobot reasoned. Isn't she the girl that we saw running on the road in front of the Orc? Yelena only recently joined the military academy, Lady Zaradnik told them. This isn't meant to be an exhibition match, it's merely training that we've walked in on. How is this merely training? Training in the Imperial Army, especially for recruits, could be strict and difficult, but he had never heard of training that was impossible. What could the girl possibly learn in a futile battle against a country-ending threat? Fight-o. On the opposite side of Lady Zaradnik, a pink-haired girl in a vaguely maidish outfit, a maid from the Sorcerer King's household by the name of Shizu Delta, according to Lady Zaradnik, offered a dispassionate cheer of encouragement. He couldn't tell whether she was being sarcastic or not. Yelena looked askance at the Baroness, but she only nodded in response. Yelena turned to face her towering adversary, squeezing her bow in her left hand. Several green objects fell out of her skirt. A squeamish sound rose from Lady Waldenstein as they realized what they were. Slimes? Rangobart frowned. Slimes, Dimir said with a horrified look. Just where was she keeping them? Yelena is something like a beast tamer, Lady Zarodnik said. I'm not sure if there's a specific term for a ranger specialized in handling slimes. The slimes arranged themselves in a double-layered formation in front of the girl, who knocked a bodkin arrow to her bowstring. Did she actually have a chance? With the addition of the slimes, the duel had become a 9-on-1. The Death Knight could only attack one of them at a time, and their small size would make them hard to hit. At Yelena's command, the little green blobs spread out to encircle their prey. Metal scraped against stone as the Death Knight shifted in reaction to the slime's movements. The air grew tense as the Death Knight was steadily hemmed in. Yelena raised her bow and unleashed her attack in a single smooth motion. The arrow hissed through the air, then clunked off of the Death Knight's shield. At the same time, 3 slimes pounced onto the Death Knight's back. A near-splitting howl filled the air, and the Death Knight twisted and turned in an attempt to dislodge its attackers. 3 more attached themselves to the Death Knight during its frenzied dance. It threw down its flambeau to pick off its assailants, but the slimes moved out of its reach. 2 of them slipped into the joints of its armor. When the next slime pounced, the Death Knight was ready. It took its tower shield and caught it midair, swatting it into the ground with a sharp metallic clank. Yelena cried. You are. The Death Knight froze, glancing at Lady Delta. A moment later, a slime squeezed its way into the visor of its helmet. The Death Knight reared back up with another hateful roar, but the wickedly clawed fingers of its gauntlets couldn't fit into the opening in its helm. Yelena's arrows continued bouncing off of its armor as it performed a strange dance across the field. I didn't know Death Knights did that, Rangobart said. One of the slimes inside of its armor probably taunted it, Lady Zarodnik said. Death Knights can't remove their armor and they don't have touch attacks like Elder Liches, so all it can do is angrily hop around. Did you just say that a slime taunted it? Yes. I know most people don't think of them in those terms, but slimes are heteromorphs. I suppose that isn't wrong, so the slimes are all warriors. Half of them are rangers, Lady Zarodnik replied. The others, Yelena, have they learned any magic yet? Yelena snapped off another shot before glancing in their direction. Not yet. Magic? Lady Waldenstein leaned in. Do you mean to say that even the slimes in your territory will be mages? Druids, in this case. They're learning how to read and write, as well. Does that mean they're treated as citizens? I thought that they were her pets. Why not both? Baroness Zarodnik said, if you didn't realize it, Dame Verilyn is my pet. Does this fall under the thing where some aristocrats give their pets titles? It used to happen uncommonly in the Empire, though he was half certain that said pets didn't have any legal authority. Either way, it seemed that the Baroness was strong enough to impose her will even upon powerful dragons. A squeal sounded from Yelena, which was echoed by Lady Waldenstein and Dimir. Rangobart looked over to find the Death Knight dangling the young recruit upside down from one leg. Yelena had dropped her bow and was desperately trying to keep her skirt from falling. Her slimes continued furiously attacking the Death Knight, but they didn't appear to be doing any damage. I suppose we should add pants to the uniform, Lady Zarodnik said. You expected her to fight in a skirt? Lady Waldenstein frowned. I fight in a skirt, the Baroness replied. Rangobart stirred at the recollection of Lady Zarodnik's equipment. Some of the Imperial Knights asserted that it had been designed by some extremely evil individual to torment men who had been deployed for far too long, or perhaps subconsciously entice them into higher levels of performance. He could only agree that it was far too effective in various ways. Can I see? Dimir asked. No. The Death Knight put Yelena down and the slimes hopped off of it to gather around their mistress. Yelena poked one of the slimes experimentally. Rangobart assumed it was the one that had been smashed by the Death Knight's shield, before nodding to herself and retrieving her bow. How did I do? Yelena asked. Conceptually speaking, Lady Zarodnik touched her fingers to her ornate emerald ear clip. I think you are doing well. If that Death Knight was a silver rank adventurer, they would have ended up as a puddle of goo. Lady Yora was right about tamers being able to easily overwhelm their opponents. I look forward to seeing how you and your EMS perform once they start branching out into their respective roles. Do you think that the Empire's beast tamers can do the same thing? Rangobart asked. If you mean coordinating several pets to tackle a single opponent, Lady Zaradnik answered. I'm certain that they could if they deemed it necessary. The problem is that it would be painfully expensive for the Empire. Undoubtedly. In the Empire, beast tamers existed in one of two occupations. The first was working in the exotic menageries of wealthy citizens. The second, and far more common, was tending to magical beasts in the Imperial Army's aviaries. With the appropriate training, these beast tamers could theoretically function as combatants with their pets, but their magical beasts, the griffins and hippogriffs of the Imperial Air Service, were far too valuable to serve as combatants on the main battle line. While slimes were far more abundant, he doubted that anyone would consider their use. How did one tame a slime in the first place? All right, Lady Zaradnik smiled. Who's next? The row of a dozen trainees took one look at the awaiting Death Knight before violently shaking their heads. It seemed that Yelena was the only one who had a special trick up her sleeve. Very well, the Baroness said. Carry on with your regular drills. They left the trainees behind, following an unmarked path between the training grounds and the base's barracks. The building was identical in appearance to the dormitory at the Faculty of Alchemy, with a modest window for each of the rooms within. This place shouldn't be all too different from the Imperial Army base in our winter, Lady Zaradnik said. It's laid out differently, Rangobard said, but all of the parts are recognizable. The only thing that's missing is the aviary. That will be added later. I don't think the Royal Army has settled on the composition of its aerial forces yet. Doesn't the Sorceress Kingdom have dozens of frost dragons? Almost all of them are full-time postal workers. Our most common military assets capable of flight are the Elder Liches. I don't think they would appreciate being stabled in an aviary. He supposed that having hundreds of Elder Liches was overwhelming enough. It was said that 5 of them could destroy a small city, after all. Lady Zaradnik led them into the barracks and they rested their feet in a large lounge attached to a mess hall and kitchen. It was nearing lunch, but there was no sign of food being prepared. He could only assume that meals were being delivered from the restaurant in the harbor village since there were still few trainees in residence. I'm starting to wonder which of your projects is the most ambitious, Rangobard said. The scale of any single one of them would bankrupt most nobles of your rank. The military base was one of my first proposals, Lady Zaradnik said. It seemed like the obvious choice for someone like me, and the operating costs are handled by the Royal Army. Fortunately, most of the projects here aren't a matter of money, but time, labor, and resources. Miss Gran quickly learned that things can go quite smoothly when you have the right mix. I don't doubt your plans will see success if things will be as you say. Rangobard nodded silently in response. He had spoken with confidence when he first outlined the opening moves for his domain, but time had a way of seasoning even the best laid plans with doubt. At least he hadn't set anything in motion yet. I try not to be overly optimistic, he said, but I suspect that I'll at least see steady growth. In the interim, I have a much more pressing task at hand. Do you think what you're doing here with your rangers applies to my war wizards? It undoubtedly does, Lady Zaradnik replied. As different as they may seem, the fact of the matter is that you're creating a new type of unit for the Imperial Army. You've noted in the past that war wizards merely exist as a function. Artillery. Communications. Magical convenience. You already know how to deliver this. The identity attached to your company is just as important as your function, however, and it will be far harder to develop. And how have you done that with your recruits? Rangobard asked. Irrespective of race, the Baroness answered, the identity of the Ranger is woven out of its long-established role in society. Hunters. Sentries and scouts who stand an endless vigil against the dangers that lie beyond the awareness of our charges. We are both the first line of defense and those who bring up the rear should flight be necessary. This identity is already etched into our cultural consciousness. Without knowing who they are, everyone already knows what they are. That includes the recruits themselves. Going by her example, what is the cultural identity of the Imperial War Wizard? The first thing that probably came to everyone's mind was boom. That didn't exactly bode well. So the identity of Rangobard's company is boom. Dimir said. It's a solid place to start, Lady Zaradnik smiled. It is what got the company approved in the first place, after all. But where will you go from there? That's a difficult question, Rangobard crossed his arms. We simply have no distinct history beyond that. It's very annoying when you think about it. Admittedly, Boom left a very strong impression, but it was so strong that it drowned out everything else. No one associated war wizards with customs duties or everything else that made up the vast majority of their work. Then again, all of the old duties may not be a part of our work anymore. Lady Waldenstein, Rangobart said. Yes? What are the restrictions on this war wizard company? Restrictions? In what sense? Is this supposed to be a company of evocation specialists? Our current war wizards are almost generalists in their scope. I don't believe there was anything set in stone in my proposal, Lady Waldenstein said. How the company fulfills its intended role is entirely subject to your discretion. Now that's interesting. Rangobart cradled his chin between his thumb and forefinger, reorganizing his thoughts away from his mistaken assumptions. The Countess' clarification complicated things immensely, but, at the same time, it made him realize that he could build a far more robust foundation than he had initially thought. I think this is going to grow into something far larger than a company, Lady Waldenstein, he said. Is that so? The Countess smiled slightly. So long as you can convince the court council that it's worth the cost, I doubt they'll have any objections. You'll have my proposal shortly after we return to our winter, Rangobart said. The door to the barracks opened and one of the waitresses from the harbor's restaurant appeared with 2 Death Knights carrying stacked containers. She nodded slightly to their party before disappearing into the kitchen. We should go and get some lunch ourselves, Lady Zarodnik said. It's going to be a busy afternoon. On the way back out to their carriage, they crossed the line of recruits heading to the barracks for their meal. Aside from the orc, they weren't too dissimilar from a group of famished Imperial Knights in training. Most were either too tired or too hungry to give them anything more than a passable salute on their way by. Once they were done with lunch, they rode a carriage north out of the village. Rangobart half rose out of his seat when he realized that the horizon ahead of them was moving around. What in the God's name is going on there? He murmured. The battlefield is being prepared for the league match, Lady Zarodnik told him. The Grand Arena in our winter sometimes went to extravagant lengths to set the stage for its biggest events, but it looked like several kilometers worth of stone was being stirred around before them. Their carriage rolled to a stop behind a long row of tiered wooden benches reminiscent of the Grand Arena's seating. Atop the highest tier was a dusky-skinned girl waving a staff around in time to the moving earth. The Baroness led them up the steps of the seating and lowered her head in a curtsy. Good afternoon, Lord Mayor. Hello. Lord Mayor continued waving her staff around as she offered an absent reply, her short, pleated skirt fluttering in the wind. Wait, skirt? Rangobart wanted to see what sort of magic was being worked in the field of stone beyond, but his eyes were ripped back to Lord Mayor to confirm the incongruous sight. What he at first thought was a girl was in reality a boy, though even when he now knew, he couldn't quite believe it. His gaze rose to take in Lord Mayor's elfin features. Was it customary for elves to dress in such a manner? He had only ever seen them as slaves in the Empire. This is Lord Mayor? Lady Waldenstein asked in a tentative voice. Yes, that's right, Lady Zarodnik nodded. I hope you'll forgive him for being unable to greet us properly. The spell he's using requires concentration to maintain. Of course. Countess Waldenstein lapsed into an uneasy-looking silence. Rangobart frowned slightly at her uncharacteristic lack of composure, wondering what was the matter. Dimmer ear, too, looked like she had been punched in the gut. Lady Zarodnik, Rangobart said, since Lord Mayor is busy, could you explain what's going on here? This is the same terraforming spell that shaped the foundations of Corlin Harbor and the settlements in Warden's Vale, the Baroness replied. We are using it to reshape the battlefield for today's league match. In front of them, a stony swell grew to form a series of curved ridges across the landscape. Outcroppings and forest-like landforms sculpted out of the dark grey granite of Warden's Vale already occupied the rest of the field, creating a facsimile of rugged highland terrain dotted by stands of spindly conifers. On either end of the field, spaced roughly a kilometer apart, were 2 wooden platforms roughly 3 stories tall. Are those where the commanders stand? He pointed to one of the platforms, which was adorned with bright blue flags. Yes, that's right, the Baroness nodded. 1 on each side. At some point, I'd like to try something more complex, but I only have 2 commanders in training at the moment. He had met both of the commanders already while having dinner with Lady Zarodnik the previous night. One was too shy to speak to him and the other acted like he didn't want to talk to anyone. Both could barely be counted as adults, yet they were both already veterans who had helped turn back the Beastman invasion of the Draconic Kingdom. He wasn't sure which was more absurd, the fact that they had done so, or the fact that they had been allowed to command the armies of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The ground trembled slightly as a shallow ravine formed in front of the seating. Rangobart glanced at the elf boy beside them. How much earth is he going to move? The Empire's castrum in the Katsa Plains was considered one of its greatest feats of magical field engineering, yet it only covered a tiny fraction of the ground being worked by Lord Mayor and required the effort of the Imperial Army Corps of Engineers, which included dozens of wizards, over several weeks. He had assumed the work that went into forming the foundations of Corlin Harbour and Wardensvale to follow a similar process, but that apparently couldn't be further from the truth. With a thrust of his staff, Lord Mayor created a spire that rose out of the center of the battlefield. It didn't even seem like he was trying to conserve mana. How often does this happen? Rangobart asked. Once a week, Lady Zaradnik answered. The league matches, or this terraforming? Both. I try to encourage adaptability for everyone involved. Right. Nothing like what we do. In the Empire, armies changed to various locations to conduct exercises. In the Sorcerer's Kingdom, they literally changed the location. After about an hour of listening to Lord Mayor MMH as he worked out every little detail of the battlefield, people started trickling in from the village. First, came wagons loaded with parts of colorful stalls which were set up in front of the stands. Most of them offered food and some even had entire stoves, ovens, and grills moved in thanks to the strength of the undead assisting them set up. It wasn't long before the enticing aromas of grilled meat, fresh bread, and hearty stews wafted on the wind. Another set of wagons arrived not long after, loaded to the brim with barrels, crates, and a gaggle of children. Many were recognizable from their tour of the village's facilities over the past few days. They split up into two groups while the undead accompanying them unloaded their cargo. What are they doing there? Dimir asked. Those are the suppliers for each team, the Baroness answered. The suppliers? League matches aren't just battles between commanders and their armies, Lady Zaradnik told them, they are also an industrial competition. The groups of apprentices that you see down there supply their respective armies with weapons, armor, consumables, and many of the other things that a real army might require. And they do this every week? Dimir said, isn't that expensive? It's a part of my fief's overall development program. League matches involve all of the harbor's industries, as well as the administration. One could say it's both a culmination of all of our efforts and a driver for continued progress. In other words, it was expensive. Much like how the people of Wardensvale regularly tore down perfectly functional buildings, all of the material and labor that went into the league matches was a sacrifice in the name of research and development. The margins created by the use of undead labor, magically assisted agriculture, and the extreme land-to-tenant ratio were in turn focused on her tiny population. Lady Zaradnik had taken the fundamental principles of domain development and applied them in an extraordinarily lopsided manner. Though those fundamental principles were easily understood by anyone who wasn't an utter imbecile or impeded by problematic personality traits, they were rarely so simple to apply. More often than not, a vast array of obstacles presented themselves to any noble who wanted to see similar improvement. By the time one dealt with matters of internal and external security, public affairs, community management, infrastructure maintenance, trade, and the various relationships with other houses one invariably found themselves tangled up in, the vast majority of nobles had neither the resources nor the time to do anything else. A realm rarely stagnated because its people for some reason didn't want to succeed. It did so because all known plausible avenues to progress had been explored and exhausted, or closed off to them by competing interests. With the advent of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, many of the old barriers had been lowered significantly. All Lady Zaradnik had to do was stroll through them while everyone else was still mired in a web of past ties. Could he accomplish the same thing? As the Baroness had asserted, his situation was in many ways similar to hers. He also had some advantages, such as only needing to deal with humans. He also had no intention of being so universally ambitious. Can we go down and see what they're doing? Dimir asked. Of course, Lady Zaradnik answered. Will you be coming down with us, Waldenstein? Oh, yes. Rangobart offered a hand to help Lady Waldenstein back down the stands, eyeing the continued rare display of disconcertment on her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. The Countess allowed Ladies Aradnik and Dimuia to walk further ahead of them before speaking in a low voice. "It's Lord Mayor," she said. "Lord Mayor?" Rangobart glanced over his shoulder. "With all of the undead and demi-humans that we've seen here, I'm surprised that an elf child could unsettle you so." "No, it's not that." Lady Waldenstein's voice lowered even further. "It's..." Rangobart frowned as the Countess put on a conspiratorial look and leaned over to whisper into his ear. "Lord Mayor is Lady Zaradnik's consort." "That's preposterous." "It's true." Lady Waldenstein hissed. "They've already produced a daughter. She was born just before the Baroness visited the Empire with Corlin and the others." "You must have misheard. I can't recall the Baroness ever mentioning having a child. Shouldn't we have seen her at some point during our visit?" A noble's household staff usually took care of a newborn so their mistress could continue seeing to her duties, but noble women still spent time with their babies whenever they could afford to. Since she was at home, they should have seen Lady Zaradnik with her daughter at least a few times. "I know what I heard," Lady Waldenstein snapped. "The child's name is Glaser. Ask her yourself if you don't believe me." He didn't want to. It would be wrong on so many different levels. "I knew I wasn't seeing things." Dimia's voice came from ahead of them. "Prez, come quick." It took a moment to find Dimia in the swarm of children. In the open field nearby, an even larger swarm of elder liches was busy summoning various beings into existence. Once the summons moved to take their place in the growing ranks of the army, the kids came to gird and arm them with equipment that wouldn't look out of place in the front window of a successful shop in our winter. "What is it, Dimia?" Lady Waldenstein asked. "The tree." Dimia pointed, "The one in the mists that took my garbage. It's right over there."